Hello, everybody, and welcome on in to another episode of Press Coverage, where we help you gain an edge in fantasy football. I'm your host, Wyatt Bertolone. Tonight, with me, Dwain McFarland, to talk about some of the messier wide receiver rooms that we have in football right now. Dwain, how are you?
I'm doing excellent, man. I really appreciate you having me on. I always love to come hang out with you guys. And look, nothing more fun to talk about in June than something that's messy, you know. And, and
Yes.
and and you know, fortunately for us, like in this space, like most things end up getting messy. We think that we get things
Mhm.
all nice and tidy, and we think that we have our arms around things, and then really we don't. Really, we don't. And like that's the
Yeah.
thing that I think that keeps us coming back. I went and played golf yesterday afternoon with my daughter. It was pretty messy. My game's pretty messy, but
Yeah.
I hit a couple of good shots, and that's what keeps me coming back. Fantasy's kind of the same way. Like I'm always striving to figure out, okay, like what's the thing we haven't thought about? What are we maybe overweighting? What are the things that we think we know, but maybe we don't really know? All that kind of stuff. So yeah, excited to dive into all this with you.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to the messy golfing, and you're right. Like, it is very rare to find things that are very clean when we're looking at these position groups across the NFL. Today, we're going to be talking about the Bears, the Buccaneers, and of course, the 49ers. Before we do, I just want to quickly give you the floor real quick. Let everyone know what you've been working on lately.
Yeah, so you can find all my work over at fantasylife.com. Also, we've got obviously Ian Hardis there, Matthew Friedman, Kendall Valenzuela, Peter Overzet. Like we got a whole crew. Can't even name everybody. Cooter Doodle, Jake Trowbridge. We got a great team over there. So lots of content, putting it up every day. We've got the newsletter. But the big thing that I've really been working on, like over the last 3 to 4 weeks, if folks haven't seen me tweeting and doing those things as much, as making sure that I've got all the upgrades in for the utilization score. So we have some cool things coming for folks there. Obviously, the utilization report is available to you there. And then I've also been working on all the projections, all the rankings, all those sort of things. So yeah, it's that time of year where people are
Yeah.
starting to care, which we really get excited about. Because sometimes, we feel like we're just talking into the void, maybe, and except for like NFL draft season, I think people are just kind of like, that's nice, but I'll care about it in 3 months. Well, now it's been 3 months, and people are starting to care. They're getting ready for their fantasy drafts. So been working on a lot of the stuff. Just say go to fantasylife.com and check it all out.
Yeah, after the NFL draft finishes up, it tends to just be like the Dynasty and bestball degenerates who are still like heavily plugged in. And now you're right, the people are starting to come back, starting to prepare for a redraft a little bit. But let's jump on into the Bears to start this off. We've got DJ Moore, Roma Dunze, Luther Burden now adds to the team. Quickly set the stage for them. DJ Moore, wide receiver 23 on Underdog, wide receiver 18 over on Fast Draft. In 2024, 14 PPR points per game. Solid year, a little bit messy, though, to go along with the theme here. Career high in catches with 98, but career low in yards per out run with just 1.44. As the season went on, after we got the coaching change that happened there for the Bears, they kind of just a lot of underneath stuff just getting in his hands and didn't amount to a lot of yards. Then we got Roma Dunze, wide receiver 34 on Underdog, wide receiver 32 on Fast Draft. Kind of disappointing year based on where he was drafted in the NFL draft, just 8.5 PPR points per game. But some could say to be expected based on the wide receivers in front of him and possibly, looking at that offensive system and the coaching that was happening for them in that year. It's rough to produce in that. He was mainly just a downfield threat. 8 out of 13.8, which was he was second among wide receivers in unrealized air yards, kind of playing into this. Things not really working out for him in that rookie year. And then lastly, Luther Burden gets added top of the second round for the Bears here. And, sneakily, we've got Colson Loveland in there as well. Luther Burden, though, over on Underdog, wide receiver 53, Fast Draft, wide receiver 48. I'll quickly just say that for me, this has kind of been Occam's razor in that I think DJ Moore's just the most talented guy there, the most we know about, and that's one I want to play into with how messy this is. There's some excitement for the others. I have some excitement for the others. But I think there's a lot of assumptions happening about the Bears right now with what Ben Johnson's going to do with them. You see they draft Luther Burden, and people say, well, this is their new slot receiver, and the Ben Johnson's offense is run through the slot. I'm just not so sure that that's necessarily going to happen in Chicago. I think that Ben Johnson could do a lot of different things with this offense. So I'm just kind of playing into the known talented asset, DJ Moore. What say you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way to think about it. We're hopeful that Ben Johnson plus a step forward from Caleb Williams, those two things together can ultimately unlock this offense. I will say that the Bears are one of the most boom bust scenarios that are out there. Like we know that Caleb Williams being the first pick overall just in 2024, like there's this upside that we're hoping is there as a passer, but we haven't seen it yet. And it isn't because he can't make the big throws. He makes a lot of the throws that the best quarterbacks in the NFL make, right? You buy time, you get out of the pocket, you find a guy uncovering late, and you hit that big play. That is a skill set that very few quarterbacks have. His problem is everything in between, right? Is this self-implosion situation that occurs where he doesn't hit the first read, when it's open 4 yards down the field on first down to get yourself into, 2nd and 4. Like you'll see him look at the read and then just keep waiting until he's wanting to make a big play. So hopefully what happens is, like with Ben Johnson coming over, it's this perfect marriage of, a few more things designed, a few more wrinkles that make him go ahead and get that ball out of his hand, keep the offense on schedule. But then when you really need it, and you've even heard Ben Johnson talk about this, he doesn't want to take Caleb Williams out of Caleb Williams' game, right? He wants to allow him to make those big kind of throws that he knows can differentiate the very top quarterbacks in the NFL. So this whole situation is combustible, but if it hits its ceiling and things go well, like there could be a lot that we like. I agree with you that DJ Moore should be the guy that we're thinking about, at the top of, at the top of the group. But I will say this, like DJ Moore, I think we've seen him long enough. Really, he's had one spike season where he turned into this true, really good wide receiver one. What's funny about that is it was with Justin Fields, at quarterback, which really we don't want wide receivers with Justin Fields. That's one of these funny things about fantasy, right? So there's always outliers to the situation. Me and my buddy Ian Harditz, we go back and forth about it all the time at Fantasy Life. He'll keep naming the DJ Moore went crazy with Justin Fields when he's talking about Garrett Wilson. I'm like, yeah, but most of the time, Ian, we really don't want a quarterback that only throw the ball for like 185 yards a game. Like let's be honest. DJ Moore, they threw him a lot of screens and things that year, so he had that spike season. But kind of where I'm going with DJ Moore, I still think there's a lot of room for these other guys because ultimately, I think DJ Moore is what he is. I think we know what he is at this point. If you look at his average career finish, it's been wide receiver 26 in a PPR format, and that's the starting point. We look at what has a guy done fantasy points per game. That's one of the most sticky things year over years, guys. So yes, look, and I'm one of the data geeks that loves to dig into all of these different metrics, but you always start with the fantasy points per game. And if we look at the last 3 seasons, there's kind of been 3 of them. 11.7, a season you didn't really want him. Then you got the 17. You're like, whoa, I'm glad I have DJ Moore. And then it was last year a step down to where the range that he's normally been in, which was right around 14 fantasy points per game. So he's typically a wide receiver 3 to wide receiver 2. He's got one wide receiver 1 outlier season. So I think we know what he is. And the thing is, all the underlying data points support that. His targets per route run, 21, 22, and 20% over the last 3 years. If you go back to 2011 and you look at the average numbers, for targets per route run, yards per route run, all those things associated with wide receiver 1 performances versus wide receiver 2, et cetera, in fantasy, those numbers I gave you all line up with wide receiver 2 to 3. And then you already talked about his yards per route run. He had that career low last year, and that could just be variance outlier. Obviously, there were some attitude problems going on with DJ Moore, which is also what Ben Johnson's trying to fix. But all those numbers tell us that he's probably a wide receiver 3 to wide receiver 2. So having said that, if the offense really takes this big step forward, you could have a really good wide receiver 2 season from DJ Moore. The beauty is, right, you're not having to pay like full sticker price all the time on that. I think you said here he's that low end wide receiver 2 is his latest on Underdog, and then over on Fast Draft, he's a little higher there at wide receiver 18. That's probably, I don't want to say that's drafting him at his ceiling, but that's drafting him closer to his ceiling based on what we know about him. But I think when we talk about these other guys, they've obviously got questions. But I think because DJ Moore, has just historically not been this massive target hog, there's just room here. If the offense does well, there is room for one of these other guys to have a really good season and potentially even pass DJ Moore as the lead player. Now, interested in your thoughts here? Roman Dunze, and look, it's tough when you come into the league with Malik Neighbors, who went bananas, and then you had Brian Thomas Jr. just winning people fantasy championships at the end of the year. Ladd McConkey really doing the same thing. And you come in with a class like those, it's tough whenever you only have 54 catches for 734 yards and 3 touchdowns. Like on alone, like those numbers don't sound terrible for a rookie. But when you come in with a class like what we're talking about, it's not ideal. Underlying data points also were not good. 15% targets per route run, 1.18 yards per route run, PFF receiving grade of 65.3. So all the things I typically try to lean into if I'm not sure about the fantasy points per game to see, is there more here? There's not. So you're really making a bet on what we thought about him as a rookie. before he played in the NFL. I think there are some positives. I think he is the guy that probably stays on the field all the time because he can be the vertical threat. The question is, will they really turn him into more than that? You talked about that we've got the uncatchable air yards, all that sort of stuff. A lot of that happens, your accuracy as a quarterback at 20 plus yards is not consistent, is not sticky. It's not stable year over year. So you could, even if you're Aaron Rodgers, doesn't matter. Like, think Russell Wilson kind of like, like he's the one guy that like, took this to the test. Like he had multiple years where he was like really consistent, but it's just something that it comes down to, the further away you get from the line of scrimmage, the tougher it is to complete a pass. So with Rome, there's still a lot of variance that could be at play here that could work back into his favor. But the thing I would really want to hear is that they're opening up the route tree for him. And if you go back and you look at what Ben Johnson did with Jamison Williams, who a lot of people think is deep threats, think of as a deep threat, a lot of Jamison's biggest plays were not on streak plays down the field. They were on big over crossing routes, and they were using route combinations to create space in the field for him. Maybe Rome gets some of those looks, right? And if he could, that would be a big thing for him. I'm just going to say one thing, and then I want to get your thoughts on Rome, and we can talk about Luther Burden too. But with Rome, the biggest challenge is like whenever you look at all those data points I just gave you, right? You look at fantasy points, you look at where he was drafted, you look at all the underlying data stuff. It's not ideal. Like his comps, come out. Michael Floyd is a comp. Traylon Burks is a comp. Devontae Parker is a comp. Rashad Bateman is a comp. Now, he went higher in the NFL draft than all of those players, but really very similar first years. If we expand out and include some guys that went in the second round, there is like this silver lining, and that's Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams is the guy that it took over 2 years for him to really break out and was honestly terrible for his first 2 years.
Yes, straight up.
And there was a lot of target competition. Like, Aaron Rodgers knew he had other veterans on the team, Randall Cobb and Jordy Nelson, that he could really trust. So, I mean, there are scenarios where that sort of thing can play out. And when you already have DJ Moore on the team, maybe that's part of what happened to him last year. And then you had Keenan Allen just sucking up. I know Keenan didn't end up having a great fantasy season, but it was pretty good down the stretch when he was healthy, and he was just like a vacuum, just sucking up all those underneath targets. And so that was a challenge. You had 2 veterans that you were trying to overcome. So another name I'll give you that fell into that bucket was Jackson Smith-Njigba. And what did he have to try to do his first year? He had to try to overcome those 2 players. So when I look at this overall, the list is not great, but when you start kind of like fine tuning the list a little bit and thinking, okay, really a guy that we thought was talented, but when he came to his first team, there were 2 really good veterans on it. And then you start to see Devontae Adams, you start to see Jackson Smith-Njigba. And so DeAndre Hopkins is another one that wasn't fabulous in year 1 of his career. Now, he definitely got better right away in year 2, but he had to play with Andre Johnson. And they played more of a 21 personnel. That was a Kubiak offense back then. So didn't necessarily have a third guy. I think it was Owen Daniels, if we're going way back, like on the tight end. So
there's a name.
I think there's a silver lining here for Odunze. I think there's a lot of potential upside. Obviously, his hit rates took a massive hit by having the year that he did, but he's the one that I found myself drafting the most, even though I do agree with you, DJ Moore has the cleanest path to relevance on the team.
And Rome Odunze, I feel like, is almost like the forgotten person in the room because of the rookie year and the new shiny new toys that are there. But before the NFL draft, the hope was, okay, no more Keenan Allen. This can open up the route tree for Rome Odunze. He might get some time in the slot as well because we think he's a player who could play like a power slot type of role possibly. And then they draft Luther Burden. And where is he going to go? Well, his place that seems like he would go is the slot, if anywhere. And maybe that means that Rome Odunze is stuck back on the outside because DJ Moore is someone who kind of plays that slot flanker a little bit. He can play a little bit of X as well, but he plays plenty in the slot too. Is there enough snaps in the slot for Rome Odunze to get some of those? Is he going to have his role change enough? I've kind of been hands off in drafts. Like I got a little bit exposure here and there. I mean, in best ball, you'll kind of want to at least dabble a little bit in some of these players who you like, but maybe just not in the situation you like, just because they can break through sometimes. And I think that can happen for Rome Odunze. But I do worry that of all the players in this room, and including Colston Loveland, his role is maybe the most defined, but in the worst way, possibly, in that if he is just kind of stuck there on the outside, being this deep threat for the team, do we get a repeat of last year
Yeah, and
to
I
an
think that
extent?
again, though, I think that's where there is the potential silver lining of Ben Johnson. We never know for sure what these coaches are going to do. Like,
Hmm.
the best coaches are trying to
Right.
maximize like their talent, right? And so
Right.
sometimes you run out of the different things you can do with one player because you have these other players that do other things, maybe in that area of the field better than they do. And Luther Burden would certainly be an example of a guy you would want to get in the slot and do those things with. But I would say again, like with JMO, even though he was lining up on the outside a lot, they did use a little bit of motion with it and did some
Right.
different things. They did still get him into some of those route combinations where he was able to use that speed horizontally, right, across the field on those deep crossers, things like that. So I think Ben Johnson will figure some things out. Of everyone on the offense, I'll say this: I think, and it kind of goes along with the Bears. The Bears are a boom bust scenario this year.
Yeah.
But if you're betting on the boom, I still think Rome Odunze, like if Colson Loveland has an average rookie tight end year, we don't think that happens anymore because we're spoiled with Laporta and Powers. But
Yeah.
guys, it could still happen, especially with Cole Kmet there. And then if you look at Luther Burden, if he does, and I don't think he's a gimmick player, but if that does turn out to be true, and
Right.
he's a guy that you can only do special like Marvin Mimsy kind of things with, things are wide open with Keenan Allen gone. Those two players are probably not replacing everything that Keenan Allen's going to leave on the table. And if Rome takes a step forward, I actually think Rome Odunze, again, this is why I was saying I think it's like apropos for this team. He's the most boom bust player on the team, but I think that he actually has the highest ceiling. I think his ceiling is still higher than DJ Moore because we've seen DJ Moore long enough to know what he is. Rome could
Hmm.
be this guy like JSN. Rome could be like DeAndre Hopkins year 2. Rome could be like Devontae Adams, year 3. Now, again, Rome, we can't think of him the same way we did last year because we now have this one data point. But I do believe there's some really similar examples of players that once they kind of shed off one of those really heavy target earner veterans like Keenan Allen, that man, things did really have an opportunity to take a step forward. So I think there's a chance that Rome Odunze could be one of the better fantasy, finds this year. So I definitely am taking my swings on it.
I definitely agree with you that of this group, Rome Odunze, I do think has the highest actual potential ceiling with his skill set. I think I just have less confidence in that skill set, and I don't want to sound like I'm like poo pooing Rome Odunze because I do actually think he's a good player. The
The
one I'm
question
actually
is if
most
you think it's priced in correctly or not with where he goes in drafts
right, which
ultimately.
I think his price is like appropriate, I would say,
Yeah.
which means like I'm going to draft some, but I'm not going to be overweight on his price because I think it's appropriate. The one that I'm actually slightly worried about is Luther Burden because I'm not so sure how he slots into the offense. Using that word because well, he should be playing in the slot most likely, just based on college profile. Although there's plenty of analysis out there that shows kind of he can work on the outside. He has experience doing that. He can play outside. It's how much he can do it in the NFL. And because of Rome Odunze and DJ Moore, does he get pigeonholed into that slot receiver? Is that what matters in this Ben Johnson offense on the Bears? Uh, I think actually one of his ways to being really relevant for us is actually him being helpful in the backfield because this is a team where we expected them to add a running back, and all they added was Kyle Monungai, who I don't think is really going to help, too much. So, are they thinking Luther Burden is going to be somewhat of a manufactured touch player, possibly out of the backfield, in addition to his other roles? Is he someone you're in on at cost too?
Yeah, like we'll always take the free touches. It's funny when sometimes people complain. Like we always want those if we can get them, but hopefully they're in addition to all the other targets that they kind of go out and
Right.
earn, like in the normal course of a week of work, right? Running the full route tree. I think that's the big thing I want to be watching for on Luther Burden, right? In all the training camp stuff, right? Number one, where is he playing? And I'm with you. Most likely, I would guess that it's going to be the slot. But he was a priority pick, for the Bears. Now he's a guy that we thought would be a round 1 pick early on in mock draft season. Ultimately, he ends up going in the second round to the Bears. But man, whenever I went back and I worked through a rookie supermodel with Burden, I just think there's a lot of different things to like here. I know people are worried about like the gimmicky stuff because of the fact that, so many of his targets did come, from behind the line of scrimmage, 32% of them. in college. And so that's a lot. That's a lot of targets behind the line of scrimmage. However, like when I went back and started working through other players that had a very similar profile, he was also able to get down the field. And some of the comps that came up for me were actually Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, was another one. And then actually Calvin Ridley Jr. was another one that came up for me. So if you look at those comps that ultimately, they had a lot of targets behind the line of scrimmage, a similar ADOT to what you had with Luther Burden. There's some really strong names in there that still ultimately ended up hitting as all-around players. Brandon Ayuk, DJ Moore was another one. DJ Moore was another one that came up in his comp group. So there's a lot of players there that give him a potential out of if he can run the full route tree from the get, and he's getting to play slot in Ben Johnson's offense, like that could be really, really fruitful. Now, having said that, you could run into some weeks where it's going to be tough because like they do have two viable tight ends as well in Cole Kmet, right? As well as what we talked about with Colston Loveland. So I think that's the other little thing you got to worry about. And if you go back to the time with the Lions, Ben Johnson, he ran some heavy personnel stuff. They don't run 11 personnel all the time. Amon-Ra St. Brown would kick out to the Z receiver spot, right? And the two wide receiver sets wasn't leaving the field. So I think it's going to be a tough road to hoe for Luther Burden to get to work outside. But the way I look at it is he still has outs. What if he's so good the Bears just decide to run three wide receivers most of the time? And they're like, just forget you, Cole Kmet. They did that to Cole Kmet at the beginning of last year, different coaching staff, but they essentially buried him. Like Gerald Everett was playing more than Cole Kmet at the beginning of last year. So I think there are paths here where Luther Burden, depending on how good he is, he could force their hand. Coaches want to get the best players on the field, generally speaking. I mean, they got to manage the locker room and give guys playing time. But I think Luther Burden does have outs. But to your point, I agree. He's got the most concerns. But again, I think it's all priced in. When you look where you get to take Luther Burden in these drafts, he's much lower than the other Bears. He's in range with Colston Loveland, but he's cheaper than the other two wide receivers. And then he still carries contingent upside too. Because if something were to happen to DJ Moore, my guess is Luther Burden is the guy they would try to use the most like DJ Moore. And, there's in the range of outcomes, he's better than DJ Moore. Like it could happen. It was one of his comps. So he's a guy that honestly I love at his price. And when I don't get Romo Dunze, I often do try to get Luther Burden. And it's not that you can't have both of them on your team and stack them and do some cool things. But Burden, man, he was a guy that the supermodel really liked. So I try to buy the shares, even though I know that like when I work the puzzle in my mind, it doesn't exactly work, but I still want to bet on the talent.
For me, we talk about all the excitement for these wide receivers. At the end of the day, it just makes me excited for Caleb Williams most of all.
Yeah. Caleb Williams, man, it's like, again, you get Ben Johnson, you get Colston Loveland, you get Luther Burden, you subtract, Keenan Allen. This
offensive line, Joe Thuney.
Caleb Williams is my most drafted quarterback right now.
I
just think that the ceiling is, and even if he just has positive regression on rushing touchdowns, we're talking about if you go back historically and look at quarterbacks that run the ball between 80 or 70 and 90 times, I believe he had 81 off the top of my head last year. They averaged like 3.6 rushing touchdowns per season. He had 0. If he just picks
on
up
almost
the
500
rushing touchdowns,
yards.
on almost 500 yards. So if he just picks up the rushing touchdowns to go with those rushing yards, and then suddenly this passing game explodes, he's actually one of the very few quarterbacks that could give you a kind of unique ceiling on the ground. Not Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson ceiling on the ground, but can give you enough on the ground for it to really matter. And he could still boom in a big way in the passing game. And those are really hard combinations to find. We want these quarterbacks that can run, but everything's on different levels. If he could turn into like a 4,200 yard passer and runs for 500 yards and gets 4 or 5 touchdowns on the ground, Caleb Williams is going to be really tough to deal with in fantasy in 2025.
For sure. We're going to take a quick moment to hear about the Dynasty Dominator app. And when we get back, we're talking about the Buccaneers.
Hey, what if I told you there was a Dynasty app where you could get player lifetime values, evaluate trades, including draft picks out to 2028, compare the advanced metrics of 2 players, look up the sentiment, buy, sell, hold on players? Well, there is a mobile app that has all of that and more called the Dynasty Dominator, and it's $5 in the App Store on Google Play. This is my gift to you, the most affordable Dynasty League domination app available today. And if you already have it, the 2025 class is ready to download. Let's go!
Back on press coverage here with Dwain McFarland, talking about the Messiest wide receiver rooms, and we're on to the Buccaneers. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Emeka Egbuka. So Mike Evans on underdog, wide receiver 20 on fast draft, wide receiver 15, 17.2 PPR points per game. His highest since 2019 might have been aided a little bit by Chris Godwin, who missed a good portion of the season, but he was having a fantastic season before that, 19.7 PPR points per game in those 7 games he played before breaking his ankle. Right now on underdog, wide receiver 36, fast draft, he's wide receiver 27. Bit of a difference there for Chris Godwin. And then, of course, Emeka Egbuka, who's drafted 19th overall by the Buccaneers, surprising a lot of people because no one really expected them to go wide receiver in the first round with all their other needs and wide receiver being placed. They were, looking pretty good. But he's going currently as a wide receiver 5 on both underdog and fast draft, wide receiver 50th on underdog, wide receiver 51 on fast draft. This one is really interesting because this offense we know is good. We know this passing offense is pretty good. Even with Liam Cohen leaving, we expect it to still be pretty good. They kind of hired within with Josh Gizzard. So maybe not quite the same thing as Liam Cohen, but we expect some of the same offensive system to remain there. And we know that Baker Mayfield has rejuvenated his career here in Tampa Bay. This is a wide receiver room that I kind of just want to be invested in general. Like I'm kind of just drafting them all as they come up by ADP. I like them all. I especially like Egbuka more than other people, I would say, just because I believe in the rookie a lot. I believe in his talent a lot. And I think this team that's going to be in 3 wide receiver sets often. And Egbuka can play outside. He actually had a better yards per out run on the outside than in the slot in college, even though he mainly played out of the slot. So I think that they can kind of move these players around. He also has kind of injury contingent upside on Chris Godwin. If he's not ready, Mike Evans is getting up there in age. Not saying he's going to regress because of age, but is on the possible radar for him. How are you feeling about the Buccaneers?
Very similarly, drafting all of them, but Egbuka is my most drafted. I think he's a really good prospect. I think he walks into a really good offense, and you talked about all the contingent upside with Godwin entering the year, a little bit questionable with the injury. He should probably be ready to go, but again, we don't know for sure. And then Mike Evans, he's going to be age 32 this year. And, if you look historically, at wide receiver production, those guys that are in that range of age where Mike Evans is, usually their production is 63% of their prime. Now, when I say prime, I look at their best 3 years of their career. And if you're Mike Evans, the best 3 years of your career is already really good. So you have a cushion there. But Mike Evans is, even though he put up these career numbers last year, it's not like we're believing that Mike Evans is suddenly a better wide receiver at age 32 than what he was at 27. That's just not the way that it works. But they did some really interesting things with Evans last year, and part of that was due to the injuries you talked about, but it was a career low ADOT of 12.7. We're talking about a guy that can be 15 to 16. So they opened up the route tree for him. They let him do all these different things, and that is what unlocked a 2.41 yards per route run. Over the last 2 years, also, he just has been vibing with Baker, 2.37, whereas Brady was much more of a drop back, survey everything, and he's going to go with that perfect read, right? He knows exactly where the right spot to go. Baker's much more likely to say, Mike Evans is over there somewhere, and I'm just going to get the ball over there. Like, that's the mentality, and so that's worked out well, but his career high in ESPN open score as well at 91. It was 68 the previous 3 years. And again, so it comes down to he did get schemed up differently. He was allowed to run more of those routes. My concern with that is now you're going to have Chris Godwin back, and you just drafted this first-round rookie, and they're probably going to run a lot of the routes that you were letting him run last year because you didn't have anyone else. And that's what allowed Mike Evans to go on that. Obviously, he's a very good player, but it allowed him to go on that massive run down the into your fantasy playoffs, and you were absolutely elated, actually, just to have any of those bucks. Like, if you had Bucky Irving and you had Mike Evans or you had Baker Mayfield, you were feeling it last year in the fantasy playoffs, and you were doing really well. So I think when you look at that, the addition of Egbuka is going to hurt Mike Evans, right? There's just no way around it, because now what happens is, especially if they go, and I'm with you, I think they're going to use more 3 wide receiver sets. I think that'll be the primary thing they're doing. Egbuka is so much more of a threat to be a first read target or to be the second read than what Cade Otton was. Cade Otton, essentially, when Godwin and Evans were healthy, was like, oh God, I'll check it down to Cade Otton, right? And he got some first read stuff as well. Like 70% of targets are first read. So target share and first read target share are like almost synonymous, just because of the way, offenses are designed. But it's a scenario, and you know how it goes. We just talked about the flip side of this for Odunze last year, and we gave those comps, right, of Jackson Smith and Jigba when we had to deal with two other good wide receivers versus just one other good wide receiver. It happens to the veterans too. Mike Evans is now going to be dealing with a third really good target. I know people think Jalen McMillan, they're like, oh, well, he was already good. Evans overcame that. But to your point, Godwin was already out, and McMillan was really just doing it on the touchdown front. He was he never really turned into like this massive target earner. So it was pretty much funnel everything through Evans and then hope that K. Dotton, Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard could just sprinkle in enough, right, to help the team. And that's what worked out for the Bucs last year. But when you get Godwin back and then you have someone like Emeka Egbuka, you can't help, but think that that's going to hurt Mike Evans. So I think Mike Evans, I'm fine. I'm with you. It's fine. I want to draft all these guys, but I think he's probably slightly overpriced because he's also in a range where the cliff can hit at any moment. We don't always know when it's going to happen. He's still obviously a very usable fantasy player right now, but it could hit. And Chris Godwin, hopefully, the injury thing is going to all, shake out and be fine. Because to your point, like at the beginning of last year, like really there were only a few wide receivers hotter than what we saw from Chris Godwin. Like, and if looking at just like and it wasn't just like the fantasy points, all of the underlying utilization was there as well. Like if you look at those first 7 games of last season and you look at the fantasy points, per game, you've got Chris Godwin sitting there in the top 10 over those 7 games. If you look at his utilization score, he was also in the top 10. The utilization score looks at your catchable targets, your target share. How are you getting used in the red zone and the end zone, your air yards, all those things that are ultimately, I basically figure out what are the most important stats for fantasy that lead to future fantasy points, and then which ones are the most sticky year over year. And then they get weighted based on those 2 criteria. And Chris Godwin was just absolutely balling out. So before the Egbuka pick, Godwin was honestly one of my most drafted players.
Same.
Now that Egbuka's there, I'm like, man, like he could even hurt Chris Godwin a little more than Evans, because Evans could go back to his role of being more the vertical guy. And you really could have Chris Godwin and Egbuka battling for a lot of the same targets in the same area of the field.
Yeah, for sure. I like you brought up Jalen McMillan. I purposely didn't bring up Jalen McMillan because I think that it is these 3, and then Jalen McMillan is down the ladder a good bit compared to them. And I like how you brought up the possible downside of Egbuka is these situations we talked about previously. And I think we both feel the difference between those two and this one is that this is a passing offense we have a lot of confidence in. And we believe that it can possibly support 3 wide receivers to the point that we like some of these prices still. Whereas, looked at like Seattle for JSN, we like Geno Smith, that passing offense is really going to get there. The Rome Odunze for the Bears last year, the still rookie QB on a coaching staff that we weren't that confident about. Like the Buccaneers, all the situation around Egbuka, I don't really have questions about any of that. I believe in the Buccaneers offensive system and the coaching staff and the quarterback. No questions there. So I'm still confident in Egbuka for that.
If something happened to any one of these 3 wide receivers, the 2 that are remaining can help you win your league.
Yeah.
If they are all healthy, it's going to be a little frustrating at times. You're still going to start them every week, but you're going to get, it's just the way it works, right? Defenses decide to prioritize to take away Mike Evans. Well, guess what? When you have 2 other really good players, you can be like, well, fine, we'll throw to Chris Godwin and Emeka Egbuka, right? Last year at the end of the year, defenses said, we're taking away Mike Evans, and Baker Mayfield said, fine, I'm still throwing it to Mike Evans. Like it takes that scenario away. Right. And so the interesting part is we know how injuries work. There's a good chance one of these guys misses some period of time this year. And so the other 2 are going to get a bump in value when that happens. And we never want players to get injured. Ian always says, hey, if they won the Powerball, Mike Evans wins the Powerball for the last 4 games of the year and decides not to play football in the fantasy football championship weeks. Emeka Egbuka, like I know this term gets overused, but in this offense, like he would have a chance to be a massive component. I'm not even going to say league winner, but guys, that he would have league winning upside for you if this got down to where it was just him and Godwin or it was just Egbuka and Evans.
Yeah, that's one of the best reasons I think to be invested in the wide receiver core is that they all have that injury contingent upside with each other. Not every team you can say that about, that they'll actually consolidate the targets to those top players.
Most teams don't, because it will always come back to talent. And that's the difference between running back and wide receiver. Running back, we still care about talent, but you can not be that talented and you get on the field. And if all other 10 guys do their job, we'll say 9, we'll let the quarterback slide. He's not really blocking, but if everybody else does their job, like, you can still be really good. Whereas at wide receiver, like, just because you're out there running routes doesn't mean that you're going to get targets, because you have to, first, you got to like beat your coverage. You got to be on the same page as your quarterback. Oh, you're reading zone, quarterback's reading zone. You're reading the right kind of zone. You know whether you should keep running if it's man or stop if it's zone. And then they got to trust you in a tight window. They know that you're not going to pop it up in there and turn it into a pick. Like, there's so many things that go on. And so at wide receiver, like, you have to have the skill set to unlock those targets. And this is one of the few wide receiver rooms where we can look across it, to your point, and all of them are good enough to do it. And all of them are good enough to take a step forward and get more if one of the other guys miss some time.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's finish up with the 49ers. Juwan Jennings, wide receiver 35 on Underdog, wide receiver 38 on Fast Draft. Then we've got Ricky Pearsall, wide receiver 41 and wide receiver 36. And then Ayuk, wide receiver 46 on both sides. So Juwan Jennings stepped up for the 49ers in 2024 with 14 PPR points per game. He was 11th among wide receivers in yards per route run, which is honestly just impressive. Juwan Jennings, I thought, always a player who looked good when he was ever out there. Never really got that many opportunities until 2024. Then Ricky Pearsall, the high draft pick for the 49ers, missed the first 6 games of the season due to being shot, which is not something you can say for most players. But when he came back, a little bit slow to get into it, but honestly finished very strong at the end of the season for the 49ers. And then, of course, Brandon Ayuk comes into the season kind of slow, possibly due to the fact that he was holding out for that new contract. He gets the new contract. He plays 7 games before he gets injured. In those 7 games, not very impressive, 8.9 PPR points per game. Only 1 game over 10 points during that time. And then he tore his ACL and MCL. Now he's recovering from that injury. With this group, I think it's honestly really tough to parse through, because Juwan Jennings, 27-year-old breakout, looked good, but how much do we believe in that? Ricky Pearsall is the guy that we would expect to be the future of the team to an extent, because he was a high draft pick for them. So we expect something from him. But Brandon Ayuk is this player who was really, really good for years on end. And then he deals with this injury and he looked kind of bad last year. And trying to piece together when the 2 of these 3 are going to be the starting wide receivers for the 49ers, Brandon Ayuk probably going to miss the start of the season. What happens when he comes back? Where are they at with Juwan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall? And then we need to think about George Kittle, who might actually just be the best of the bunch because, well, that's what he was last year. So how are you attacking this 49ers wide receiver core?
Yeah, George Kittle is one of my most drafted players. I know this is a wide receiver show, but man, George Kittle, what he did, look, I'm on board with Trey McBride and Brock Bowers, those being the top 2 guys. Like, you can't project, George Kittle for 140 targets like you can those guys. But he is capable of spiking in that same sort of way. And I do wonder if folks are, I get it, he's going to be 32 years old, but I do wonder if I think he's going too far behind the other 2. I think he should be closer to them in ADP. And if you were to ask me about pure ceiling, I think that Kittle actually offers a higher pure ceiling than those other 2 guys, because he is a bigger yak player. He is a player that can attack down the field more. And he's a guy that's proven that he can score touchdowns. And if you go back and you look at the very elite tight ends that have been worth drafting over wide receivers in round 2 of your fantasy drafts, like, typically they've been guys that have come through with massive touchdown seasons. I'm talking 10 to 17 touchdowns for these guys like Jimmy Graham, Rob Gronkowski in his biggest years. Kelsey was always more in that 10 to 12 range, but obviously coming through with a lot of receptions. And those guys, one thing they all had in common is that they could work down the field as far as their average depth of target. We're not seeing that from Trey McBride and Brock Bowers. They mostly work underneath the coverage, more like an Evan Ingram, Jonnu Smith. And I'm not saying they're going to be those guys. Like, I love both of those players, drafted both those players a ton last year, was very happy with them. I've been drafting them this year. But if we're talking about a true archetype that could break fantasy, I think it is really George Kittle, because he can do all the things that we have seen the absolute smashes. When I say smashes, talking about giving you a chance to score 18 plus fantasy points per game. And if you look at it, man, like, go back to 2018 when he was 25 and you didn't have Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk there. He had a 26% targets per route run. That's elite for a tight end, and a 2.82 yards per route run, also elite. Next year, Deebo gets there, but still working his way in as a rookie. 31% targets per route run and a 3.12 yards per route run. Basically, George Kittle was Julio Jones Like those are Julio Jones. Those are elite wide receiver numbers. Now I get it. We don't have a time machine. He's not 26, but he still looked really good last year. He had a 22% targets per route run, a 2.62 yards per route run, which is just insane still for a tight end. And now we've got all these questions with what's going to happen with Ayuk. How long is it going to take him to come back? How good is he going to be whenever he gets back, right? We're looking at the fact that Debo, as much as people say he's washed, like we don't know that, Ricky Pearsall can step right in and fill in for either one of those guys, Ayuk or Debo Samuel. And then your point with Jauan Jennings, he did have a 24% targets per route run last year, which was amazing before the Brandon Ayuk injury. And then he ended up going on his run and he was really good. I'm with you. I am buying Jauan Jennings, but I won't be surprised if there's a rug pull. And the reason I am buying is the intensity of his breakout. It wasn't like he barely broke out. It was like, dude was just, he was out there balling out. He was really playing well. But back to this whole thing with Kittle, I do think this is one of the years, even though I think I haven't projected for like 94 targets, man, it would not surprise me if it was 130. And if he somehow gets to that number, he was already the tight end 1 last year, which people forget, over Brock Bowers and over Trey McBride. He could go nuclear. Like he could be more like having a wide receiver, and he has the best price of all of them. The only thing really working against George Kittle is the fact that he'll be 32. And we know that these cliffs can just hit. Now, I will say tight ends do historically, even though they battle more injuries through their career, they can age they age a little bit more gracefully. Now, when you look at a guy like Kittle that's such an extreme athlete, that may not be quite the case. But still, I think he's one of the best bets right now in fantasy football. I'm clicking his name so often in round 4 or 5. I don't see myself stopping.
Yeah, I'm with you. If I have to make a pick from this wide receiver core, it's going to be Jauan Jennings because he's the one I feel the most confident about in 2024 in his role on the offense, lasting throughout the year. But yeah, George Kittle's the pick for me. If we're gonna take someone from this offense, it's gonna be George Kittle. I'm just in on elite tight ends in general this season, probably more than I have been in the past. You always dabbled in some elite tight ends, but this year it really feels like Bowers, McBride, Kittle, like these 3 can really separate themselves from every other tight end in football. And I think Kittle, it really should be in that conversation with them.
And I think the beauty of Kittle is you don't have to take him where you have to pass Ladd McConkey, Achane, AJ Brown. Those guys, it's easier for those wide receivers and running backs to get to an 18 to 20 fantasy point per game season than it is for the tight ends, even if they're really good, because to hit one of those kind of seasons as a tight end, and we are talking PPR right now, but to hit one of those seasons as a tight end, like you've really got to hit the touchdowns and you've got to hit the big plays. And so wide receivers just get more big plays. Wide receivers get more touchdowns for the most part. So it's just one of those scenarios where the trade-off costs for Kittle, you're now down in a range where the wide receivers and running backs that are going around him, man, that's the other part of the equation that's making me take him so much. One, I love him and he's a really good player, but 2, man, the trade-off, the opportunity costs that I'm trading off whenever I take him are far lower than what you have to do with Brock Bowers. I think you could make an argument with Brock Bowers, like, honestly, you should never take him over Achane. I think you could make that argument. I'm not saying I'm not telling people to never do it, but it's hard for Bowers. Like it's almost impossible for him to have the same ceiling as Achane. Like if the Dolphins suddenly just said 65% of everything's going through Achane, he's already been at 55 and Tua stayed healthy and their offense was back to what it was 2 years ago. Achane, could be the running back 1. And we just know the running backs can score so many points. So I think that's the other beauty of Kittle. I am with you. Jauan Jennings is the other name I'm taking, but I'm also dabbling in Ricky Pearsall. He did come on at the end of the year. He's a player that the rookie supermodel last year thought was overrated versus his draft capital. But having said all that, like the 49ers liked it enough to take him in the first round, and now they've got an opening. And you could see Pearsall just jump out to such a big start that like they don't rush Brandon Ayuk back. Like it's the 49ers, it's Kyle Shanahan, and we also have a quarterback that we trust at this point, and Brock Purdy. Yeah. Like we know he's a good player. So these are all guys that I like to be drafting. I think we're pretty much in alignment, like in which ones we like the most. But I think ADP is pretty reflective of it already.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, Dwayne, this was awesome. I really appreciate you joining me here. Before we get out of here, though, remind everybody where to find your work.
Yeah, just head over to fantasylife.com, guys. You can check out all my work there, as well as everyone's else. I've got the projections. We've got the rankings all up. Actually about to get off whenever I leave this show, go update things for the J.K. Dobbins signing, because I've been working on other things today. So I'll have that done. And then, of course, the Fantasy Life YouTube channel as well, where you can catch all of our shows and content from multiple folks contributing over there.
All right, everybody, if you're not already following everything Dwayne does, you really should be, because he's one of the best out there. And I really appreciate you joining. Again, as for me, you can follow me on Twitter at WyattB_FF. Make sure you're liking and subscribing to everything Player Profiler, signing up to Fast Draft. Use code Wyatt for a $50 deposit match. I appreciate you. We'll see you next time.